Welcome to the podcast, Not Your Doc Anymore, where we address the issues essential for your health and provide information to help you become your best advocate. We encourage empowerment through education. I cannot emphasize enough the power of clinicians who understand clinical practice and are actually seeing patients on a regular basis and have had years of experience. Here to address the topic of nutrition is Taylor Dunn, a registered dietitian. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Taylor. Taylor received her bachelor's degree at the University of Utah, and then she went on to get her master's of science in nutritional science and integrative physiology. I just have to say on a personal note, I've known Taylor for years, and I've seen her grow up and be this amazing person. It is so great to have you here, Taylor.
Thank you. I'm
Thanks for
excited to
agreeing to
be
do
here.
this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm
So
honored.
you are currently working in a private practice here in Mill Creek, Utah at Positive Nutrition. Tell me about your practice before we get started.
Yeah, I work at a private practice. I see my patients outpatient on a pretty regular basis, like once a week, once every 2 weeks. And I specifically specialize in eating disorder treatment. So I'm working with a lot of people on correcting their thoughts around how they think about food, their relationship to food, their behaviors. And then I just do nutrition in general, trying to help people find what works best for them. And I do a little bit of sports nutrition too. So working with athletes and making sure their nutrition's honed in. So I love it. It's the best.
What an
Yeah.
awesome thing.
Yeah.
Okay, our first question is going to be this. What are the benefits and risks of popular diets like keto, paleo, intermittent fasting? And how can someone determine if a diet trend is right for them?
Yeah. That's a great question. I feel like there are new diets popping up all the time. So it's hard to know which ones we can trust and which ones maybe aren't super helpful for us. The first thing I tell people to think about is ask yourself the question of, can I do this diet forever? Because what we ideally want to do with our nutrition is find the general framework that's going to work for honestly the rest of our lives. And that sounds silly, but we ideally want to figure out what works for us and then be super consistent with it and stick to it to see really good long-term results and to give our body what it needs and to fuel really well. I, to be completely frank, am not a huge fan of diets. I don't see them be super successful long term when we're talking like real life. I think a lot of times they'll work in the short term, but then the question is like, what do we do after that? So the biggest thing I
Right.
would consider before jumping into a diet is really considering like your lifestyle, what you're looking for, and what's important to you, right? There's not going to be one thing that works for everybody. And I'll also preface by saying I've seen people have eating patterns or do certain diets that totally work for them that I maybe wouldn't have like necessarily recommended out from the
Sure.
start. It's not an easy answer, that's for sure. But if we're talking about like a lot of the mainstream diets right now, some of the big ones are like keto and carnivore. And those ones, typically in the beginning, we're going to see some pretty significant weight loss because our body switches its form of energy basically and depletes itself of glycogen, and we lose a lot of water weight and things like that.
Can we
Yeah.
define maybe what a keto diet is? I think
Hmm.
somebody maybe just
Yeah.
not know what that is. Give me maybe a
Yeah.
little definition of either of those.
Yeah. So a keto diet is where you're primarily eating proteins and fats and you're very eating very little carbohydrates. So it's lower in
Okay.
fruits and vegetables, lower in whole grains. It's going to be higher in like our animal proteins, our dairy products, our fats like avocado, olive oil, those sorts of things. And then the
Right.
carnivore diet is even more extreme than that. So it's basically zero carbohydrates. So you're really not doing any like fruits,
Oh,
veggies, grains, beans, nuts, seeds, anything like that. Mostly just meat products, basically.
now let's talk about the science of that. I
Yeah.
like where you were going with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely research to show benefits for certain populations, like kids with epilepsy. definitely have benefits on being on the ketogenic diet. It decreases their seizures and really helps with their overall well-being, right? But for most people, the keto diet or the carnivore diet is going to be something that's really hard to stick to long term. Obviously, if we think about going out to eat or eating at someone else's home or different situations like that, it can be a little bit extreme.
Mm.
And with these new types of diets, we're still doing research and figuring out the pros and the cons. And we're seeing a lot of negative research come out when it comes to like our cardiac health and an increase in cholesterol, and it can negatively affect our gut health when we're eating too little fruits, vegetables, fibers. It can negatively affect our kidneys. And so there's just things to be aware of with those ones.
Okay,
So, yeah.
sure. Okay, but you were talking a little bit about the process of why it works, storing fats, glycogen. Maybe
Mhm.
talk a little bit about the science so we can understand that.
Mhm. So basically what happens is when we're doing the keto diet or the carnivore diet, we are depleting our system of glycogen and glucose, which is our body and brain's preferred source of energy. And so, without those two things, our body has to find a different way to make energy. And so, it will start burning fats instead. And that's when it goes into like ketones in our blood and things like that. So it's just switching the energy source. And so again, because we are not holding on to glycogen, we do see weight loss because we're not holding on to as much water anymore, right? But for a lot of people, we want to use glucose. We want to use our glycogen, right? Especially if we're athletes or active. Those are really important things and really beneficial. So again, not my favorite diet to recommend. It's pretty extreme. It cuts out a lot of things that are really beneficial for us, and it's not always not the best long-term solution in my opinion.
Okay. How about intermittent fasting? I know that's been very popular.
Yeah. Yeah, so intermittent fasting is interesting. I feel like with everything in nutrition, it's not a one size fits all. So for some people I've seen it work and be successful, and for other people I've seen it totally backfire. And that's why we have to take into account what our lifestyle looks like, what we need, and what will work best for us. So, the intermittent fasting trend, the most common way to do intermittent fasting is you fast for 16 hours and then you give yourself an 8-hour eating period. For some people,
Mm.
that might look like eating from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. and then fasting the other 16 hours. I see this be the most successful when this already matches someone's natural way of eating or metabolism. So if I have somebody who is not a huge breakfast person, they don't really get hungry in the morning and they tend to start getting hungry around 11 a.m. and then they have dinner closer to 7 p.m., then that could be totally helpful and work well for them. For people whose metabolism gets revved up in the morning, or they wake up hungry, or again, they're active in the morning, I think this one typically tends to backfire because we tend to push off our hunger trying to follow this like time frame. And in doing so, we often lead our body into more of an overeating pattern, right? So, one of the concepts of intermittent fasting is we're basically cutting down the time in our day that we're eating. So, for some people, that puts them into a caloric deficit, right? But for other people, because we're pushing off our eating, that puts them into this mode of being starving, overeating, sometimes going into that more binging stuff. And so, this one depends on the person very much. I also think one of my, I guess, issues with intermittent fasting is we aren't looking at what we're eating, right? And what we're eating is what's going to affect our overall health more than anything. Even if we're calorically down, we still want to be aware of what we're eating. So it doesn't always matter exactly when we're eating. And so there's different things like that. One thing to note about about intermittent fasting, I typically never recommend it for women because it tends to negatively impact women's hormones, their menstrual cycle. It can lead to a decrease in our metabolism by shortening our windows. So that's one kind of caveat with that diet.
What are some other diets that you typically recommend to patients
So
or people who come into your
the
office?
diet that I recommend the most is actually, interestingly enough, not really a diet. It's more of a eating pattern or a lifestyle, I guess you could say. And that's probably one of the reasons that I like it. But it's called the Mediterranean diet. And it was just ranked the quote best diet for the 8th year in a row because of the benefits that we see from it, the long term benefits, how much it can help with chronic disease. And the Mediterranean diet basically emphasizes fruits, vegetables, unsaturated fats, whole grains. It puts our lean meats and our fish and our dairy sort of more in moderation. And then it encourages being more aware of our red meat consumption, our fast food consumption, and our sweets. It's also really cool because part of the diet is that it encourages healthy exercise and encourages healthy relationships and stress management. So it's cool because it kind of takes into account our overall well-being versus just this strict diet we need to follow. And one way to kind of think about it too is you could just look up an infographic on Google of the Mediterranean diet. And more than anything, just try incorporating more of those foods into your eating pattern, right? There's not this like super strict, you cannot eat this or you can't eat at this time. And so that's one that I always recommend to people to consider if you're looking for something.
Great. Do you ever recommend just traveling to the
Exactly. You
Mediterranean
have
just
to
to
start
get a
there. I think
feel
that'd
for
be a
what that
great
diet
solution.
is? It is great when you go there because you
Hmm.
realize that it's just part of the culture
Yeah.
that they sit and their eating is long and the food is
Hmm.
wonderful.
Yeah. It's a cool one.
So you can see how you could recommend that diet.
Yeah, exactly.
Get some good sun. As you're sitting and talking, Taylor, can I tell you how many times in the 30 years of practicing medicine that I would want to have this very conversation with patients or this conversation with the dietitian?
Hmm.
So this is
Oh, good.
priceless.
Good.
Love
I'm
it.
glad.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah.
The follow-up to this is because of your expertise in working with those that
Hmm.
have eating disorders,
Hmm.
when should you be concerned that a diet or a plan crosses over to an eating disorder?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. So, interestingly enough, one of the biggest risk factors to developing an eating disorder is dieting, right? Because dieting puts us
Yes.
into this mindset of game playing and number obsession. And an eating disorder is a psychological struggle with being obsessed with food and how our body looks and overthinking. And a big thing to think about is is the way that I'm eating negatively affecting like my mental health and my overall well-being, right? Because in this world we live in diet culture, in this kind of food obsessed society that sometimes we find ourselves in, sometimes we almost think we should like struggle through the way that we eat. And really, ideally, we want to find a way of eating that makes our life better, right? We want our eating to help us feel good, give us energy. We want to be able to enjoy our food. We want to be social with food. Food is so much more than just what we eat, right? It's cultural, it's social, it's all of these things. Um, and so the biggest thing I would be aware of is if you are having to sacrifice important things in your life to stay on a diet or make a diet work for you, that would be a big red flag for me. And another, maybe instead of going on a diet or being super strict with yourself, we can think about taking little bits of things from diet and implementing them into our lifestyle. And maybe we'll get into this, but I am so much more a believer in small behavior change over long periods of time and making those things last and turning them into habits rather than going on a super strict diet every Monday. And so just being aware of like genuinely how you feel and how it's affecting you.
Great. Oh, that's such a great answer. Thank you. Are there any dietary journals that would be of value that you typically use? And are there resources that we can look at maybe on our phones or some
Hmm.
other
Yeah.
guidelines that we could use?
Yeah, for sure.
And is it helpful to journal your diet?
That's a good question. I think food journaling can be super helpful because a big part of nutrition, especially as we're if we're starting to look into it and we want to make changes, big thing we need to do is be aware, right? And I always explain to people, let's start where you're at. So let's just start building awareness. And so food journaling can be super helpful for us to just be aware. I think all of us know how it feels to be like, I guess I don't really know what I eat or what did I eat yesterday. I'm not a huge fan of calorie counters because they don't give us a long-term solution. I never want anyone to feel like they have to count calories for the rest of their life, right? And so if you have a good relationship to something like a calorie counter and it's not going to become obsessive for you, that's something you could try for a few days just to gather some data more than anything. But
Hmm.
I think outside of that, food journals can be super helpful just to bring that awareness. I really love an app called See How You Eat. It's a food journal app that has you take photos throughout the day, which sometimes feels easier than writing things down for some reason. And if
Sure.
you're a
Yeah.
visual learner, that one can be helpful. And then Brighter Bite is one that I recommend for somebody who has struggled maybe with an eating disorder or some disordered eating, or just wants to be a little bit more cautious. That's just another food journal where you're going to write things down. I also really love the websites Harvard Health and Johns Hopkins Medicine because they have really up to date nutrition information if you're ever curious about something or looking for a good answer to something. All of their stuff is obviously backed by research, it's up to speed, and they have just like a really digestible way of phrasing things. So that's one to check out.
Great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Good resources. Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you address the question of I've been exercising, changing my diet, and I never lose a pound?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. That can be very frustrating, obviously, for
Yeah.
people. So I think a couple things to consider when it comes to our weight. It is not as simple as here's what I'm eating and here's how I'm exercising. For some people, it totally might be, right? For some people, they tweak their eating a little bit and suddenly their weight changes one way or another. For a lot of people, we want to look at like overall lifestyle. So when someone comes in for a dietitian appointment, we're going to run through how are you sleeping? What are your stress levels like? What kind of exercise are you doing? Are we overdoing exercise? Are we sedentary most of the day? For a lot of people, when they're trying to change their weight, I see a lot of under eating that can lead to overeating, right? Or for some people, under eating actually leads to weight retention. And so we really want to look at the bigger picture and see what's going on overall, right? If we're stressed, it's going to be really hard to lose weight. If we are not sleeping enough, it's going to be hard to lose weight. And something to always consider is, does our body want or need to lose weight? Again, we live in this like weight obsessed world and culture, and it often feels like we're all supposed to be the same weight or look the same way. And I think it's really important to take into account, is it even healthy for our body to lose weight? And in some situations, it might be, right? But sometimes when our body is not wanting to lose weight, that might be a sign that our body wants to stay at the weight that it's at. It can be stubborn that way. So that's something to think about.
Okay. That's great.
Yeah.
So give me some realistic and healthy ways to approach weight loss or at least weight maintenance.
hmm Yeah. Again, let's be realistic about what's actually healthy for our body. I cannot tell you the amount of times that somebody's come in and explained what they're doing, their exercise, their food, their sleeping, all these things. And they just are dying to lose those last 5 to 10 pounds that everyone's always talking about. And my answer for them is I genuinely wouldn't recommend you change anything. Like you have great energy, you say you feel really good, you're eating super well, you're doing all these things. If you started to tweak things, I think it would negatively affect your health, right? It might change your weight, but it would negatively affect your health. So I think it's really important to separate those two things, right? Our health and our weight. So when we think about weight loss or weight maintenance, though, I think the biggest thing is considering small and steady changes to your lifestyle. So again, it can be really tempting to start this huge change. We plan it out and it's going to be totally different from how we've been eating and what we've been doing. That's typically going to backfire because it might last a week or two. Our body was not prepared for it. It's a huge change. It's a huge lifestyle change. So I would way more recommend small changes that then we turn into habits that then we can start building more small changes and we keep building on that. It's definitely not a glamorous answer. It's the slower long-term solution that sometimes is going to take like years to get into a good mode with, but that's how I would address weight maintenance or weight loss for the long term.
That's a wonderful answer. I think it's so great because I think all of us have been in that point where we
Uh-huh.
want to make those big changes. In
Yeah.
fact, my classic is, okay, I'm going to really get in shape. And I would go run 5 miles and I would just kill myself.
Mhm.
And then I would never be able to exercise for another month. So
Totally. That's
I
how it
think the
goes,
same
right?
the same thing happens in food, right?
Yeah.
Is what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Totally. Our body gets used to what we do, right? So if I'm somebody who is not cooking and I'm relying a lot on fast food and I don't consume a lot of fruits and vegetables. And I tell myself, okay, starting tomorrow, I'm going to cook all my meals and I'm going to have fruits and vegetables at every single meal. That's just not going to work, right? It's just, we just
Yeah.
tend to not be super realistic about it and exploring things like, okay, I'm going to start cooking twice a week. Or if we're not exercising, period, I'm going to go for a 10-minute walk 3 days a week. We just want to slowly work towards those goals instead of jumping headfirst and having it not last.
That's great.
Yeah.
I actually listened to somebody recently talk about wanting to exercise, and it was just so refreshing to me. She said, I wanted to start to exercise, so I decided I was going to run for 2.5 minutes every day.
Mhm.
And then the next week I did 5 minutes. And then
Mhm.
the next week I did, it was amazing. It
Yeah.
was just such a refreshing perspective on that.
Yeah.
So
It's
I
such
think
a better
the same
solution.
thing happens with our diets.
Yeah, huh,
That's what you're saying.
absolutely. We have to be
Awesome.
realistic, right? We have lives and it's important to put nutrition and our health, but we have to be realistic with it. That's awesome.
This is such a hot topic right now, the topic of insulin resistance.
Mhm.
And so, how are you addressing insulin resistance through diet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the best thing we can do, and interestingly enough, even if we don't have insulin resistance.
Maybe tell me a little bit about what your perspective is on
Mhm.
insulin resistance, and then we'll talk about your answer. Is that okay?
Yeah. So, insulin resistance is when our body is producing insulin when we are eating food, specifically glucose, carbs, or sugars, right? And our body sends insulin out to then take those sugars out of the blood and put them into our cells to create energy. And when we're struggling with insulin resistance, what's happening is our body is not listening very well to our insulin. And so we're having sugars stay in our blood for longer than they are supposed to, which over a long period of time can ultimately be harmful on our body and how it functions. That's not the most scientific answer, makes sense to
Perfect. That
people.
was pretty good.
And so with insulin resistance, as it goes with nutrition, the best thing we can do, I think something that people think or worry about is okay, now I can't eat carbs. I can't eat sugar. I shouldn't eat fruit. I shouldn't eat grains. And that's not true at all. Our body still wants those foods and needs those foods, but we just want to think about how we give them to our body and how we almost help our body out. So I recommend pairing carbs with a protein or a fat because what that will do is basically slow down how quickly sugar gets into our blood. So if I'm going to eat an apple and I'm going to eat it by itself, my body's going to be able to digest it pretty quickly and I'm going to get the sugars in my blood pretty quickly. But if I do an apple with peanut butter, that's just going to slow down the process because it's a little bit harder for my body to digest protein and fat. And so I help my body out by giving it a balanced snack. So this isn't something we have to live and die by, right? You can eat an apple on its own. But for the most part,
Yeah.
trying to add a protein or a fat will just help balance out our blood sugar, which will help with the insulin resistance. More fiber is always a great idea. So adding fiber to our meals, adding fiber to our snacks. That's going to be fruits, vegetables, beans, lentils, grains. And regular meal times actually too can also be really helpful so that our body knows when to expect food. So eating frequently throughout the day, not trying to not eat in the morning and then all of a sudden have a huge lunch and afternoon and dinner. So really spreading out our food can also be beneficial for that.
That's great. How
You
does
good?
gut health impact overall well-being? And what are foods or habits that support a healthy gut microbiome?
Our gut is actually referred to oftentimes as our second brain. And so it's hugely important as it relates to our mental health and our well being. I definitely think it's gotten a little bit out of hand on social media. All of a sudden, everyone thinks that they have gut problems. And when you have gut problems, so you can trust your body to communicate that to you for the most part. Um,
Yeah,
but I think the best thing we can think about is focusing on just adding more whole foods. So, what we can think about with our gut is we have bacteria that lives in our gut. And what we want to do is keep that bacteria healthy and keep it balanced. And the way we do that is we feed our body prebiotics. Those are going to be in any fruits, veggies, whole grains, nuts and seeds, beans, or more fibrous foods. So, focusing more on those, incorporating those in our day are going to be the best things to just help regulate our gut. And then there are probiotics, which help our gut bacteria stay healthy. We're going to get a lot of those in our fermented foods. So, those are some of our more odd foods that we may not be consuming all the time. That's going to be yogurt, kefir, kimchi, kombucha, sauerkraut, right? We're not consuming those things all the time. We definitely don't have to necessarily either. But if you're struggling with gut health and you're feeling like something weird might be going on, I would start by boosting those two groups of food. And then we can always supplement probiotics too. So that's definitely something to consider since those can be a little bit harder to get in the day to day diet.
that's great. All right. How do you use labs to help evaluate a patient's health?
I think of labs or explain labs to my patients as a way that our body like communicates to us, right? And we're going to look at where is your A1C, which is a test that basically looks at your past 3 months, your average blood sugar levels, and is that normal and is that healthy? What are our triglycerides looking like? Our cholesterol, vitamins, minerals. For the most part, these are good to get checked once a year, right? We don't have to obsess over these things, but they totally can be helpful when we're trying to implement changes. I think a lot of times too, it can be really motivating, right? If we see we have high cholesterol, we can look at,
Mhm.
okay, here are some things that we can actively do to better that number. And so, yeah, they can really help us steer the ship on what behaviors we might want to focus on the most or change. And interestingly enough, too, they can show us what we're doing a good job at.
That's great. How about, I know there's a lot of talk about the
Mhm.
CGM or the continuous glucose monitor.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about that. And maybe I'm just going to get back to the question I had before, which is when should
Mhm.
we be concerned that either a diet or a lab
Yeah,
crosses over to an eating disorder with
definitely,
the CGM?
because we don't want to become so obsessed. I explain it as we don't need to outsmart our body. Our body has these built-in systems that are amazing and super beneficial because we can eat and live our life and exercise and go on with our day without knowing exactly what's happening in our body at all times. And so it's awesome that we have science and that things are
Right.
advancing and we understand things more and more. But sometimes that gets a little messy and we get a little obsessive. And so there are definitely situations where a continuous glucose monitor could be helpful, right? If we are at risk for diabetes or if we've slipped into the pre-diabetes range and we want to learn how our body's responding to the things that we're eating, I can totally see how that would be helpful. For the average healthy person that, you know, has their body is functioning correctly in that sense, a continuous glucose monitor is not going to be super helpful because even if we eat perfectly right, let's say, we always eat carbs with a protein or a fat, we really balance out our meals and our snacks and all these things, we could still have high blood sugars. And that's just our body regulating and working and doing its thing. And the beautiful thing is, our body knows exactly what to do if we have a high blood sugar, right? It just works on it and brings it back down. So I explain this to my patients as if we were to try to manage our heart rate. Like if we wanted to keep a perfect heart rate all the time, one, that would be totally unnecessary. And two, it would be impossible. So I almost think of our blood sugar in the same sense. We don't need to perfectly regulate it all the time.
That's great. So I have a daughter who's diabetic. She's been diabetic for almost 20 years, and she struggled so hard to get a continuous glucose monitor because she has a pancreas that doesn't work and doesn't get all those signals. And so it took years to finally get to it and really expensive. So now she's seeing these people who are healthy walking around with CGMs. I'm personally a little bit disappointed because it costs so much and the effort was so significant to actually get one to be able to have it function for as her pancreas. Crazy.
And it's one of those wellness fads that just took off. It became popular for some reason, and people started feeling like they had to do it, and that's something they had to worry about, where we didn't need to worry about it before. So sometimes we got to take a pause and be like, wait a second, is this really what I need to be doing?
That's good comments. All right. Are supplements necessary for a balanced diet, or can all nutrients be obtained through food alone?
Especially in this like wellness culture, social media craze that we're seeing right now too. Supplements are not always necessary. I encourage people to try to get all of their vitamins and minerals and their needs through their food first because one, it's cheaper, and two, it's more available in our food oftentimes. And so we might as well do it that way anyway. Plus, then it encourages us to eat a balanced diet, right? So we absolutely can get what we need from a balanced diet. And I really encourage people to look at what they're doing and how they're doing first, and then supplement from there versus just going willy-nilly with supplements. There are absolutely situations where people should supplement. If somebody is vegan or vegetarian, I recommend they supplement their B vitamins, their vitamin D. Depending on where you live, a lot of people need to supplement with vitamin D because it's hard to get in food and we're not always able to get it through sun exposure. So there's definitely a time and a place. For some people, I just recommend like a multivitamin, right? If you're unsure if you're getting everything or you struggle to eat a lot of fresh or whole foods on a really consistent basis, then a multivitamin can cover your bases really well. I think the big thing to be aware of or remember with supplementation is that the FDA can't review our dietary supplements for safety and effectiveness. And so it can become a messy market. And the supplement industry, I believe, is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they want us to buy their products. And so they're going to do a really good job at marketing them. And I have yet to find a supplement that has fixed everybody's problem, right? So we really want to look at supplements on a personal level. If we have lab values that are off, then we could find it helpful, right? But I don't want people to get caught in the web of spending a ton of money and feeling like they have to go to the supplements to get their needs met.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the FDA doesn't really have a division that's saying this is regulated. They are, I believe, self-regulated. I used to always say that you could grind up grass, put it in a pill and sell it and you would be okay. I know we used to do it for placenta.
I had a patient one time who was having really weird hypoglycemic episodes. So she was having low blood sugars, and she was a totally healthy, and she was super fit and active, and she was eating well, and she kept having these low blood sugars. And she ultimately realized that it was one of the supplements she was taking, that she had started taking, just not thinking too much of it. And You just want to be aware when you're starting a new supplement, like notice any side effects and just proceed with caution. Don't fall into the trap that you have to do it.
How can someone identify the emotional factors influencing their eating habits? And this is probably something that you deal with in your practice more consistently,
I see
more
a lot of emotional
consistently.
eating. It's super common. And to some extent, emotional eating is normal, right? We've all had a bad day and treated ourselves to a cookie, or gotten home from a stressful work day and finished a bag of popcorn without meaning to. But it can obviously start negatively affecting us when it becomes more common or more frequent. And emotional eating is not always maybe the coping skill that we want to go to, of course. The biggest thing that I have people do is, again, bringing that awareness of identifying, like, when is this happening for me, and what emotions am I feeling, and what's almost my like routine with it. And then we want to work backwards from there. So let's say that somebody is like,
Mhm.
I eat at night after getting home from work and I go straight to the couch and I grab a bag of potato chips. And that's where I start emotionally eating. And that's where it starts to feel out of control. I always encourage people to look at three different areas. So, one, physically, we want to make sure we're eating enough in the day, right? Because if we're not eating enough consistently throughout the day, our biology, our body is going to catch up and encourage us to go eat potato chips on the couch, right? To catch up on all the food that we've missed throughout the day and to get more energy. So we always want to check in on that. Are we setting
Yeah,
ourselves up well in terms of, are we
right.
eating enough? And then two, I I always really I want people to consider what like emotion is leading me to do this, which this can be the hard part. Sometimes we're like, I don't know. I'm stressed, I'm tired, I'm overwhelmed. Who knows what it is, right? And then I think a third area to look at is, how has it become
Yeah.
habitual? A lot of people will almost have a routine that they don't even notice that they have. So it might be that they come home, they put on sweats, they log off from work, and they go to the couch. And so one thing I might encourage is, okay, you are not allowed to change your clothes before you start emotionally eating, right? We want to make it less comfortable. We want to catch ourselves in the routine a little bit. So there's definitely different areas to look at. It can be really hard to identify those emotions or where it's coming from, but we almost want to think about replacing the activity, because eating is an activity. It's something we do with our hands, and it's something that we get happy endorphins from. And also too, if it's really something that you're struggling with, it can be really helpful to work with a therapist or a dietitian, maybe whichever one is more helpful, or both, to like work on changing that habit and that routine. Because sometimes we can't find maybe solutions on our own. We need like a different person to look at it and tell us what might be helpful to consider.
In our home, we say when you go
Yeah.
to put on your sweats, we call them our quitters. You know, it's funny, ever since I had my injury, I pretty much wear sweats, and I don't know if it's just life
Sweats are
is,
an
I've just
important part of
quit.
life. I'm not saying don't wear sweats. Trust me.
All right. We're gonna cover this topic, and I think this is really just adds to all the things that you're saying, which are start with small things and work up from there. And so I'm gonna just have you, if you could, give us some top
Mhm.
5 dietary recommendations that are good for adults and top
Okay.
5
I
dietary
love it.
recommendations that would be great for children. And maybe this would be a good first place for somebody to start. Say, gosh, all this is so overwhelming.
I'll start with adults. I think that a lot of times what I leave people with in the first session of working with them, I call it the 6 pillars of nutrition. And those are fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, unsaturated fats, and water. And so the thing to start with is making sure, are we consuming some of those foods on a regular basis? Are we giving our body genuinely what is nutritious for it? And if we are exploring lifestyle changes or tweaks we want to make, I typically recommend making sure that we are including those 6 things. So that's a good baseline to start with. That's going to be helpful if you are
It's great.
just wanting to overall feel good and get healthy, if you are struggling with any like cardiac issues, if diabetes runs in your family, if you're an athlete, right? That can be a good sort of place to start and examine. One of the best things I actually think that adults can do for their nutrition, and a really good place to start, is working on your relationship to your hunger and your fullness, which I think sometimes sounds cheesy. People are like, okay, thanks so much. Yeah, great. But we tend to lose the ability to sense if we're hungry or full in adulthood, right? And we're born with this like system that's really good at communicating
Yeah.
to our body what we want to eat, when we want to eat, when to stop eating. And if we don't feel like we're in a good place with that, that can be a really tough thing to build off of and try to work on our nutrition without. So that's definitely something that I recommend for people. And then I think the next
Great.
one would be make nutrition work for you. So try not to fall into this trap of, okay, my neighbor's doing this diet. I better try it. Let's evaluate, what is work life for you? What is family life like for you? And let's find a nutrition eating pattern that works for you instead of making ourselves work for it. I always say stay in your
Mhm.
lane. Take nutrition into your hands and figure out what works the best for you. And then let's see, I think something which we've touched on for sure today, but be cautious of what you're listening to on social media these days. And again, put your blinders on and just check who you're listening
Mhm.
to and what's going on and all that stuff. And I think the fifth thing I would say is focus on behaviors versus an end result. Because as long as we are beating ourselves up for not losing weight, checking the scale every day, we're going to stay stuck in this unhealthy and unhelpful pattern. Where if we really hone into, I really want to try
Mhm.
to eat more fruits and vegetables, and it's not so much about our weight or changing our body or anything like that, it's going to last so much longer. It's going to feel so much better. And we can really figure out what works the best for us, right? Same with exercise and all of those things.
It's great. How about for children? What are some good dietary recommendations that we can leave with today for children?
So I think a lot of these obviously will
Children.
apply to parents of younger kids and older kids too. I really encourage parents to help their
Yeah.
kids learn their hunger and their fullness levels. And so trying to like have those conversations and trying to encourage, okay, are you hungry right now? Okay, are you full right now? Kids are actually really good at listening to their hunger fullness because they haven't had years and years of eating out at restaurants or following diets, which is where we tend to lose our hunger fullness. So helping your kids learn those cues for themselves. I explain it to
Mhm.
kids like, you know how your body tells you to go pee and you know you need to go pee? Your body tells you that it's hungry and you need to go eat food when you're hungry. Or your body tells you that it's full and we need to take a break from eating. It's also really important with kids to try to avoid setting foods into categories like good and bad or putting any foods off limits. This can just, from a really young age, form a pretty negative relationship for kids with food. And that can be something that lasts a long time. So try to just have different types of foods and explain that obviously they play different roles and they have different places, but they're not good versus bad necessarily. I think the third thing I would say when it comes to, and again, this kind of involves parents, but provide food for your kids and allow them to choose what they eat of it. That kind of is the parent child dynamic that we recommend as
Mhm.
dietitians because that allows kids to know their options, they know what's in front of them, and they can pick and choose, and they have the ability then to learn more so how to listen to their body versus like external cues. I should say too, these are all so much easier said than done. So we're not going to be perfect at these things. They're just good like frameworks to think about. And then
Yeah.
another helpful thing for kids with food is
Sure.
having roughly set meal and snack times. And so we want to try to avoid grazing all throughout the day or constantly going back and forth for food all day, right? It's totally appropriate to explain to your kids, like, okay, lunch is at this time. This is when we're eating lunch. If you don't eat lunch right now, you're going to be pretty hungry because we're not having a snack for a few hours or something. But that can really help kids regulate their like
Sure.
hunger, and it can prevent them from overeating or getting into a mindless eating habit or things like that. So setting those expectations there. It doesn't have to be the same time every day, but it really helps them regulate to know when food is coming and when they're going to eat. And then I think the last thing I would say, number 5, is helping them see food as something that gives them energy, helps them focus, allows them to play sports, like talking about food in that way so that it has a really like positive, beneficial spin to it, and they can just overall form a good, healthy relationship to it. That you would be surprised how helpful it is to form a healthy relationship to food as a kid. That just will last them their whole life. So those are things I would think about from like a kid's perspective.
Well, Taylor, this has been amazing. This is so good. And so good to be able to see your face and see you grow up as such a competent advisor for people who really, I think, need a lot of health guidance.
When you were introducing me, I was like, he probably has known me my whole life. You have. So I appreciate it. And I'm very honored to be here. I look up to you a lot as a provider. So I appreciate it.
You're so sweet. Okay, wonderful. This is the end of our podcast. And I just want to say that you can find this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music, and YouTube at Not Your Doc Anymore. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Not Your Doc Pod or DocWatts_. Thank you to all those who made this possible. Natalie Watts, the president and CEO of Not Your Doc Anymore, LLC. Our social media managers, Taylor Seberg, Emily Brown, Sarah Marion, and our production manager, Joshua Watts. We must clarify that the medical advice or procedures do not substitute for your own professional medical consultation. In addition, listeners or viewers need to be aware of the limitations of the information provided generally.
Thanks, Darren.